Page 278. Most of those who have not achieved the human type of psyche structure will have a difficult life, full of disappointments and dissatisfaction, conflicts and injustices, both in their family and outside the family. And they may have to die not an easy, well-arranged from above death, but a painful one, as a result of illness and injury. So I completely disagree with this wording. In my opinion, everything is exactly the opposite. The more unprincipled, the more unraveled a person is, the more chances he has to achieve success. Using my family as an example, my grandfather went through 3 wars, saw a lot of things from what could be seen, and he died a very long and painful death. How can you comment on this?
Our evaluations do not always correspond to objective evaluations from above. This is the first thing. That is, why the grandfather died a long and painful death. This is a deep question. This is one side of the question. The second side of the question: what kind of relationship did he have with God? This is the main question. Because in general, if everything is normal, then people die, having fulfilled their mission in life, sometimes in extreme old age. And in general, their departure is not accompanied by pain and suffering. We are mostly biased towards our relatives. If you look at it from a distance, then explanations are found as to why this is exactly what happens. Because in general, each person carries his death in himself. That is, this is a kind of program for the self-liquidation of the organism. Because the organism is not intended for eternal life. And then the question is, what external stimuli will cause this program to action and will be its catalysts? For some, the loss of the meaning of life is enough. For some, the search for sensual pleasures leads to cirrhosis of the liver. But in any case, everyone carries this program in themselves, it is interactive, somehow interacts with the outside world, and given that the psyche of each of us is not an isolated in itself informational algorithmic system, life and its functioning takes place in interconnections with egregors, then what egregors you fit into, so the result will be. If a person is closed from birth, for example, onto 2 conflicting egregors, this can often be if the child is a child of mixed marriages, and ancestral egregors are in conflict, then instead of a biography there will be a history of disease, because the battlefield of these egregors is his psyche. And until he decides in what kind of interrelationship with these egregors he is, how from which egregor he will defend himself, and so on, his psyche is a walkthrough for them and nothing good will happen.
In sociology, it is said that either the child chooses one of the sides and accordingly presses the opposite side with energetics, either the father or the mother, or he needs to rise in terms of worldview above both of them, perhaps thereby resolving the essence of the conflict.
Yes. Intuitively, he may not rise in world understanding, but in the Nravya sense, he may be higher than them. Well, imagine the situation. One of the parents has several generations of ancestors in Judaism, Behind the other parent, several generations of ancestors in Orthodoxy and Catholicism, well, what will happen? For the child, it will be heavy, because truly, not everything fits together. If he rises to religiosity and sophist, then all these egregorial conflicts, the dogmatics of both creeds, they will not affect him, because to any egregorial message, he will have his own answer in sophist. And if he is a hostage of this, he will not go anywhere from the system, and the only question is whether there is enough parental love to protect him from their own ancestral egregors. And so, in general, nothing good will happen, because conflicts of ancestral egregors in relation to one and the same child, they are usually expressed in a decrease in the level of health, in the statistics of bad luck, and much more. If any of the egregors works for his destruction, as a carrier of alien information, alien to this egregor's algorithmics, then it will be very bad. An example is the egregor of the Goncharov family. If you go to the linen factory and sense what is happening there, then the egregor of the Goncharovs was a rather evil egregor, which did not tolerate anything Blagorius and Dobrius, and in the end, it killed the last member of the family. He got pneumonia when, during the spring flood, he went on a boat and rescued peasants. It seemed that he was doing a Dobrius deed, but the egregor was intolerant.
Page 392. About age and understanding of the stream of providence at this age. In other words, when faced with the fact that God's will cannot be overwhelmed, and by the age of 13-14, having already a fair amount of knowledge about the life of nature and contemporary society, and about the history that is memorable to society, a person is able to understand what exactly lies in the stream of providence, and what exactly is determinedly contrary to the realization of providence. Question: how, at the age of 13-14, and also in principle at a different age, can one understand what lies in the stream of providence and what does not? At this age, apart from games and a computer, there is nothing in the head.
Well, really it turns out that at the age of 13-14 years, a child approaches the maximum intellectual power in our culture. By this time, the brains have already developed, and, on the other hand, prejudices do not yet block intellectual activity. Therefore, at the age of 13-14, a child is able to understand what, in principle, it was impossible for him to understand before, and what it will be problematic for him to understand because of the prejudices that will be formed during further growing up from 13 to 23-24, when the personality is fully formed. And if the parents have not trampled the sophist in the child, then at the age of 13-14, he really can understand and understand a lot, including how providence differs from allowance in the concretics of their manifestations. Sophist is simply like a binary marker, allowed, not allowed, but why and how, this is about intellectual power. Sophist should regulate intellectual activity. But if the sophist says allowed, then the intellect will say what exactly can be done specifically and how to do it in the current circumstances. If it is not allowed, then the intellect, if it works, will explain why it is not allowed, what kind of damage someone will receive, why and how.
What is meant by the term heteroqualitativeness?
Initially, it is understood that a pair of this, not this, is given in distinction. In distinction, a person from God is given the ability to see differences in the concretics of their manifestations, this, not this. A set of some characteristics is a kind of characteristic portrait of an object or subject. If these characteristics in their set do not coincide, then this is a heteroqualitativeness. And if they coincide, then this is uniqualitativeness. But within the boundaries of quality, there can be various quantitative measures of this quality.
And ordinal measures.
No. Ordinal, this will already have an impact on quality. Because what is more important? Well, let's say we are designing a car. We set a hierarchy of requirements for it. What kind of hierarchy are we going to have? We can have variative hierarchies. And further, it turns out that if we set the hierarchy of requirements in a certain way, then the statistics of mortality in road accidents are close to zero. If we set the hierarchy in a different way, then we get a cheap car to manufacture, but the death rate in the event of an accident will be very high. Insurance companies in the West are engaged in such cases. Indeed, in order to determine the value of insurance rates, they must assess the risks. How to assess the risks? We pick up the statistics for the last, say, 5 years, and find out that no one has died in the Volvo 860 over the past 5 years. Accordingly, insurance for Volvo will be lower than insurance for something else. And if for a person, the main thing is speed, then we get a sports car, the prospects of survival in which are close to zero. Because at a speed of 150 kilometers per hour, in the event of a collision with something, any car simply rolls into a tube. By the way, there is a video on YouTube. The British are crashing a Ford Focus at a speed of 150 kilometers per hour. And moreover, they are doing so from a catapult, and not on its own. That is, it is without gasoline, therefore everything happens without fire, but the car is done for. There is also a video on YouTube. General Motors is crashing. If I am not mistaken, a 59-year-old Impala against something newer. In the Impala, in general, everyone would be dead, although it is large. And in the something new, even the dashboard does not move from its place, although there was a collision of 25% overlap. Therefore, the question about requirements is really about a hierarchy of requirements, and it changes the quality of objects. Well, the basic heteroqualitatives, they are given to a person in distinction.
When I tried to understand something from all these books, I understood that, in the beginning, you are given a distinction that is given directly by God. And then, as I understood, all this knowledge that is given to you is superimposed on this distinction. On the other hand, it turns out that some Bedouin, shepherd and illiterate, he lives by совесть and intuitively strives for certain actions. Will he somehow distinguish more in life than some honored academician? Is that how it turns out?
It's just that culture is culture. Culture, after all, is also a part of our life. Bedouin culture is one, our culture is different. But then, for a Bedouin who lives by совесть, there will be much fewer problems than with our crooked academician, who formerly did a lot of things in science, but in fact very much harmed both the country and humanity, because knowledge, after all, is twofold.
How in life to distinguish which of them will have more, Bedouin or academician?
Within the boundaries of the fate that is given to everyone, everyone will distinguish, but the personal development of the academician will most likely be blocked, and nothing will be given to him in distinction until such time as he brings his world understanding into accordance with providence. Simply look at what people leave behind, how this all developed throughout their lives. And many are considered outstanding. They really were only engaged in form creation after a certain age period. New content did not appear in their works. One such striking example, this is the popular in the West, Ayn Rand. The latest analytical note is devoted to her. How in her youth she had the opinion that egoism is the engine of progress, and until the end of her days, in general, she played the same tune. And if you look at her creativity and at the real history of the 20th century, then her graphomania is by itself, and history is by itself, and all her conceptions in general, they are not for our world, because they are not compatible with the objective laws of being. Well, in the West, she is an outstanding philosopher, teacher, and so on and so forth. It is simply that distinction, this is the basis for the further development of a person. If a person stopped in personal development, or deviated somewhere in the wrong direction, all new knowledge, new something, that would allow him to express new knowledge, it passes by him. It is not given to him until such time as he comprehends everything correctly that was given to him earlier.
During our studies, we had questions that we accordingly asked our teachers, and the teachers gave exactly the opposite answers. One such question, which is the most general and less detailed, conception or doctrine?
In general, both of these words are foreign to the Russian language. Therefore, each user of the word can hang his own meaning on it, and they can act both in the quality of synonyms and in the quality of antonyms, depending on the concretics of their use. For me, conception and doctrine are generally synonymous. But there may be someone who will say that no, that conception, it is this, and doctrine, it is that. Let's take a look at history. The Dewey Doctrine. Giulio Due is an Italian aviationist of the early 20th century. What is the point? Powerful bomber aviation destroys the enemy's rear, and thus victory is achieved. But the same thing can be called by the word conception. After all, the military doctrine of any state is, in essence, the conception of using the armed forces to solve tasks of politics, as Comrade Clausewitz says, by other means.
I understand the conception as a system of use. Can you call a system of use a doctrine?
You can. A doctrine is also a system of use. It's just that when words from other languages come, it is always a question, why and who brought them? What meaning do they acquire in the language that has adopted these words? Because when new words come, quite often they acquire some specific narrow meaning, which allows not to burden the words of the native language with some alien to them meanings.
How to say it in Russian?
In Russian, it is generally difficult, because the Russian language is characterized by the absence of its own generalizing concepts. Many generalizing concepts in Russian are taken from other languages.
Here is another phrase, the root of the mental tree. What is it?
По-моему, это в социологии было. А может, нет. Что такое корень мысленного древа? Я вот пытался представить это, но так и не представил. Что же такое?
If we think in processes, do we start with something?
Видимо, да.
If we start with something, then this something can be called the root of the mental tree. That is, this is the starting point.
Why call it that? So I imagine some kind of tree, branched roots.
But if we think in processes, this is a multivariate result in the end. A process of thinking, it will branch out at some point. Therefore, in my opinion, the term is quite appropriate precisely because it correctly characterizes the process of thinking as a branching process.
Then it just turns out that we have not one apparently starting point, but several.
But the initial data for the starting point is also a certain plurality. The starting point is this. I don't remember exactly what it's called in botany. Well, this is the border of the root and the trunk. This is truly the point. And below it, the initial data, the roots, a certain set of connections with the objective reality of this starting point of thinking. So we get a root of a mental tree. And further, it again agrees well with our favorite metaphorical drawing, where it's about the structure of science, when the tree, the roots, the methodology of cognition, Then the trunk is the sufficiently general theory of governance. On the border of the trunk and the branch, metrology, as the doctrine of correlation about abstractions of the sufficiently general theory of governance with the concretics of the applied area, and the soil is the objective reality and texts of past eras.
The gardener who cuts, is this philosophy?
The gardener is not philosophy because the gardener, he appeared from a different theme. The gardener appeared from the work The Garden Grows by Itself. There it is about the fact that the global historical process, yes, it does go by itself. But along with this, there is someone who cuts and suppresses some tendencies and gives others a violent, active, sometimes to the point of pulling by the ears, stimulation. But new tendencies are not created because the tendencies, they are by themselves. Yes, you can sow the seeds from which these tendencies will grow. If you throw some idea into society, but the tendencies, they develop on their own. And further, the question arises, what tendencies to push, what tendencies to stimulate? We live in the conditions when the liberal team is intensively stimulating all tendencies that lead to the degradation and self-destruction of our society. It will end when someone says clearly, and it will be generally accepted, that if a person sincerely promotes liberal ideals, then he is an idiot. If he does not sincerely propagandize, then he is a swindler in the style of Ostap Bender or Pavel Chichikov. Or, even worse, he is a traitor who propagandizes them so that the country is an object of exploitation of transnational capital and its owners. But in reality, after all, no process can flow outside the stream of psychodynamics. Psychodynamics can be defined in such a way that everyone does what he wants, does not do what he does not want, and the result turns out to be what the result turns out to be. The psychodynamics of society is a process, in general, a thing in itself, which is realized in some way. Realizes the algorithmics, informational support that people carry, and what turns out is what turns out. Indeed, with a different nraviousness of people, a different world understanding, perestroika would have been different. Because when Saji Umalatova really raised the question of trusting Gorbachev, when Bludov raised the question of trusting Gorbachev, neither the Congress nor the Supreme Soviet supported them. But if they had, then an investigation would have been carried out. It would have turned out that Gorbachev and many other guys are either conscious traitors or they are manipulated by the periphery of foreign special services, and accordingly, history would have taken a different path. But both the deputies of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR and the delegates of the Congress of the CPSU, in general, were unable to make the correct historical choice. And if they were not able to make the correct historical choice, this choice was made for them by others and imposed on the entire society. Why imposed on society? Because the society was also indifferent.
How was it supposed to participate? Sociology says that this is the ignorance of sociology among secular people, although almost all of them are engineers, doctors of sciences.
Well, engineers, that's fine. But in terms of sociology, psychology, there was complete boundless ignorance. In addition to that, massive governorial illiteracy. Because what governance is, at best, a certain number of engineers could tell in relation to their narrow field of activity. If he is a specialist in anti-aircraft missile control, then he will tell you how to get this missile into someone else's plane, even if this plane will jump aside and jam. But if you ask him how to ensure the governability of an automobile, then there will be a whole bunch of questions because he knows the concretics of the implementation of laws of governance in his activity, but does not know these laws that are implemented in any process of governance. Therefore, it was so there, and in general, on top of everything else, there was a mirage that academicians were consistent. Therefore, when Agenbegyan talked about how glorious it would be to live in a market economy, everyone believed in it. Well, if not all, then the overwhelming majority believed in it and hoped that market reformers would successfully resolve all problems. In essence, society is a crowd-elite society, and even if someone is not a crowder, it is generally characteristic for a normal person to be aware of the boundaries of his competence. And if the matter is such that you need to go beyond the boundaries of your competence, then a normal person shies away from such matters, because far from everyone can develop professionalism at the pace of development of the situation.
That is, you need to have the courage to say that I am incompetent.
The point is not even in the fact that you have to say something courageously, but a lot of people who were not crowders and were responsible people, they understood that they could not enter the sphere of state governance because they are professionally inconsistent for this. But people like Gaidar, Chubais, they were actively rushing into this sphere, although they were also professionally inconsistent. This is the difference between a добросовестный person and a non-добросовестный person.
I don't even know who among the professors and academicians will have the courage to say, sorry, but I can't answer your question.
There are probably just one or two such examples. Because academician Anshishkin in 1987 directly said that science was not ready. Vasily Leontiev. In his works, there is also a statement on the theme that the problem is not that the economists do not want to solve relevant tasks, but the problem is that there are no methods that allow solving these tasks. But you can count such people on one hand, and the rest are convinced that if he is a diploma of graduation from a higher educational institution in a certain speciality and a list of works that no one has read, then he has already taken place in this quality. And when it comes to solving concrete tasks of precisely a social governorial character, then further there begin conversations on the theme, well, Dvorkovich. Economists were invented so that forecasters would look good against their background. Academician Krylov in the old days said that I refer to the number of exact sciences, mathematics, astronomy, navigation, and to the non-exact sciences, astrology, palmistry, meteorology. So in Krylov's list, economic science falls after meteorology. But Dvorkovich is a deputy prime minister, and there are no complaints against him, although the man said bluntly, in artistic form, "I am professionally inconsistent."
Maybe his function is like this.
It is not a question of functions. The point is what society expects from the government and what the government does.
Is there any sense then, in all these scientific seminars, collegiums?
There is a sense. Firstly, some part of the public, faced with this information, realizes that they are very much wrong. In the soft version, this will block their activity. In the hard version, this will lead to the fact that if they strongly oppose, then by doing so, they will activate the self-liquidation program. And domestic science will suffer great grief because someone there somehow took up and died. The second side of the question consists in the fact that among the youth, not all are idiots and scoundrels. And the future, it has never been determined in history by what is under the hump of distribution. The future has always been shaped by those who are in the tails of distribution. Moreover, in the tail of distribution, a volume that is oriented not on a roll back into the past, but on the solution of a problem inherited from the past and on creating a future free from those problems. Look at how it was in history. What is under the hump of distribution, it does not think about problems. At best it suffers them, at worst creates them. The majority both endure and create at the same time. The reasons are different, including the reason that people do not know how to feel and think. These are the features of upbringing. A certain minority that thinks, is aware of the problems, it takes care that these problems are solved. And while the rest sit back and reproduce the old way of life with all its problems, they take some actions that change the character of the life of society, and a future different from the past arises. I do not mean a change in the technosphere. I mean a change in social organization, a change in the statistics of society in terms of psychological types. I mean exactly these things. I mean a general change in culture, because there are a great deal of courses in culturology, there is a lot of graphomancy, but the main thing is not said there, that there are only three main principal typological attributes by which cultures differ. Culture is an informational algorithmic system, and as an informational algorithmic system, it carries in itself some relations, not in the subjective sense, but in the algorithmic sense. Relations towards certain factors of life. There are three such characteristic relations. Relation towards creative potential, relation towards will, as the ability to subjugate oneself and the course of events around to conscious purpose consonance, and relation towards совесть and shame. Everything else is all sorts of shells, candy wrappers, clothing on these three. But these three factors, in different cultures, they are also different, because a culture can be such that the creative potential in it is a crime against it. and everything that does not fit into the standard is subject to destruction. This is of the ISIS type. Development is excluded. Another variant, creative potential of any person, this is a people's property. Therefore, trampling it down is a crime. Perverting it is a crime. It must be mastered and realize itself in life. In general, this ideal was proclaimed in Stalin's times. Further, the relation towards will. There are also many variants. All are willless slaves. There is a hierarchy of right to will. That is, in relation to the lower ones, you are obliged to manipulate them. In relation to the higher ones, you have to do what they say or what they hint at, or how they manipulate you there. The third variant. If there is no will, then a human is impossible. Further, the relation towards shame and sophist. So, the creative potential and will by themselves, when they are, this is demonism. It is able to destroy the planet, and not only the planet, simply by reason of its ignorance, an intensive creative activity that goes beyond the boundaries of its competence. If the creative potential is realized by a volitional order under the power of the dictatorship of sophist, and this is the case for each and every one, then this is a normal human society towards which one must strive. And when we talk about the impact of these or those minorities for making the future on the culture of society, then the changes impact each of these parameters and are expressed in the statistics of suppression of creative potential, suppression of will, suppression of shame and sophist. And the development of society is expressed in the fact that statistics are shifting in the direction that creative potential, will, shame and sophist, this is the norm of the behavior of every person.
It seems to me that these questions are not asked at all in culturology.
In culturology in general, there is not even an intelligible concept of what culture is. If you open different textbooks, then there are a lot of different words. What is spirit from the point of view of physics? Culturologists will not answer you on this. But any normal humanitarian discipline should have roots in natural science, because if these roots are not there, then the humanitarian discipline is a kind of orchid parasite. Orchids do not have roots. They grow on other trees, feed on their juices and everything else. Yes, beautiful, but in reality, they are in general parasites. If scientific disciplines, humanitarian ones, do not have roots in natural science, then they are doomed to be parasites. They cannot be connected with objective reality in this case. Very often you get fictions, because you can fill an abstraction with real content, but a fiction, well, it's such a pretty intellectual game, a toy. But how to use it in life? No how. It is impossible to fill it with any life content. Therefore, it is impossible to use it in life.
What is spirit?
The system of world understanding which dominates in science, it is eye-centric, and it is conditioned by the system of senses of the organism. What we see and what we feel, this is matter, dense matter, the so-called. That which is not visible and not tangible, but it somehow still impacts subtle matters, spirit. In terms of modern physics, spirit, this is omnifarious force and other natural fields. Spirit, like force fields, like physical fields, it carries some kind of information. Carries some kind of algorithmics, is somehow formatted in nature. All this here is the competence of physics, and everything that concerns information and algorithmics, this should be in the competence of the humanities, in application to the spirit that a person carries.
Can a person's spirit be measured physically?
You can measure it like any physical phenomenon. Well, you get that this is some power in some watts. Yes, you can. But does this characterize anything? Yes, this characterizes in the aspect of medicine, because if the tension of the biofields of the organism falls below some critical level, then this should be dealt with by doctors. And everything that concerns life activity and the so-called high spirituality, this already refers to the informational algorithmic filling of the spirit. But this is not measured in watts. It may sit at some vanishingly low powers, but by force of the fact that it is harmonious with the world, everything around will respond to these low power emissions.
It seems to me that it is impossible to measure at all. It is not material.
It is material. Fields are material, if you look at it from the point of view of physics.
Everyone has some kind of spirit. Further, for all mortals, the last day will come, death. Where does the spirit go?
Well, if you believe the traditional, moreover, of different people's beliefs, then in 3 days there is a separation of spirit and substance. Within 3 days, the spirit can be returned to the body, and the body can be revived to life. After 3 days, an irreversible separation occurs. On the 9th day, there is a separation of spirit and soul. These are two different things. The soul is a non-worldly entity that comes into this created world from the world of God, does something here, and returns to God. But the spirit, as a system of fields, is a part of this world. And further, it remains in the memory of the planet, as a kind of accrued work. Now, if you look at the Greeks, the dead are shadows. That is, there is no soul. But there is a memory of the living person, his algorithmics, that is, behavioral skills. This is. But there is no subject who could govern and develop all this, because the subject is a soul.
Is the spiritual heritage the sum of all these shadows?
Spiritual heritage, this is what a person perceives in his individual biofield from the biofields of parents, ancestors, from the ancestral spirit, and ultimately from the noosphere of the planet as a whole.
I read somewhere that when a person is born, his soul is a kind of soul from God. A path settles into him. And in addition, some program is added there. Or it starts to be worked out from scratch. Is there anyway a legacy a priori existing already?
A legacy always exists.
And it was written there that children inherit not the parent's mind, but his passion.
I do not presume to say that children inherit passions. Children in general, from the ancestral spirit, perceive some nraviya standards, if they cannot be replaced by some other standards under the guidance of an upbringer. This, by the way, is the problem when foster children end up in a family. If foster parents are not engaged in their upbringing, the formation of nraviousness, ethics, and the child was born in a dysfunctional environment, that is, his biological parents are deeply vicious people, then there comes a moment when he replaces with the nravya standards from the ancestral spirit of his biological parents. And when it comes to raising foster children, there one of the problems is to protect the child from his ancestral spirit. Because if this is not done, then he'll receive from the ancestral spirit a lot of nasty things that will aggravate both his life and the life of foster parents to the point that he can kill them.
This is all described in the first volume of sociology. There, however, it was not connected with egregors.
This is in the context of egregors because this is really one of the aspects of personal egregorial interaction. There is not a single organism, not a single psyche, that would not be connected with these or those egregors. And with biologically conditioned egregors, we are connected by the fact of birth from certain parents, in a certain genus and belonging to a certain people, race, biological species Homo sapiens. On this, pan-biospheric egregors at the place of birth or at the place of long-term residence are closed. Well, and then, on this basis, culturally conditioned egregors.
How is structuralist governance different from self-governance?
Self-governance can be realized both in a structural way and in a structureless way. And self-governance differs from governance. Because if we talk about governance, we are directly involved in the process of governance. And we govern the object of governance in the course of this process. We drive a car, step on the pedals, turn the wheel, pull the handle when necessary, everything is going well. But if we make a car with autopilot, it is governed by itself. We sit, we look, maybe even there is no driver in the car at all. This is the difference between self-governance and governance. And the difference between structureless governance and self-governance It may or may not be, because the structuralist method of governance can be expressed also in the process of self-governance. For example, the entire set of passengers on a bus without a conductor. They are engaged in self-governance. But if we want to organize a stock market panic or lead an election campaign to certain results, then we disseminate certain information in society. Everyone self-governs. This is a structuralist governance. But the process does not go on by itself, because we purpose-orientedly upload certain information there in order to have a result. How is it done? Look on the internet, on YouTube. Winter School for High School Students at the Higher School of Economics, led by Sitnikov. This is the man who was one of the first in the Soviet Union in neurolinguistic programming, a political strategist. He tells how they secured the election of Yeltsin in 1996 and a few more. This is not a bluff. Everything is counted. The only question is in statistics. What statistics are you interested in? If for you society is a kind of faceless amorphous mass, there will be one result. But if you are able to connect certain characteristic statistics with society and understand how statistics change under the impact of this or that information, then you can structurelessly govern tendencies and their implementation in the society. This is already political technology. That is, self-governing and governed processes, they can also proceed structurelessly.
A quote from sociology. Sociology is the broadest discipline, broader is only ethics. The phrase is incomprehensible, broader is only ethics.
It's just that sociology is the concretics of human society, and the relationship with God, this is already ethics. Ethics enter society from the outside and leave society also from the outside. And ethics regulates the interrelationships between the carriers of reason. If we recognize as reasoning only an individual from the species Homo sapiens, then ethics is localized within society. If we see not human extrasocial intellects, then ethics goes beyond the boundaries of society, and ethics becomes broader than sociology. And about this, in the same Fundamentals of Sociology, it is said,
that is, ethics is broader than sociology, in the sense that it can go beyond the boundaries of society.
It goes beyond the boundaries of society, if this is the ethics of a normal human. If you look at it from a distance, ethics in human society appears from the outside, because a person, by predestination, is the steward of God on earth. And Sovest is also directed at ethics, at the formation of certain ethics. And if, again, to refer to the times of the pagan world, then for the pagans it is in the order of things to communicate with the natural elements, and therefore the magi are cloud dispersers, that is, some people abiding in a certain mood and possessing certain nravious ethical qualities could agree with nature about how, what, and why. And from the point of view of scientists, what I said is nonsense. Take this to a psychiatrist. But from the point of view of life, if you are so clever, then why is the planet in such a state?
This is probably a consequence of governance.
And governance is a consequence of what? And governance is always a consequence of scientific methodological support. And that picture of a long process and the main culturological regularity of the life of civilized societies, science. Science merges theories into the system of education. The system of education forms the mentality of officials and all governors. Further, they correlate the flow of operational information in their activities with what they were taught, work out governorial decisions. Implementation of governorial decisions in life generates a certain quality of life. Therefore, if the quality of life is not pleasant, then we begin the audit of science. If in 1992 the Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro adopted the conception of sustainable development, then to all those who believe that with the question of magi, as about cloud dispersers, to see a psychiatrist, we have another question for them. What have you done from 1992 until the present? Where is the scientific methodological support of state and business governance in accordance with the conception of sustainable development? Why are the educational standards that exist in all countries of the world, in all educational programs of social governorial and economic governorial profile, full of nonsense? But there is no information and knowledge necessary in order to govern according to the conception of sustainable development, which should guarantee the elimination of the global ecological crisis, solve the problem of poverty and cultural inconsistency in many countries, end wars and the threat of war and intersocial tension and crime.
One scientist says this: our task is to cock a doodle do. These words express the fact that they can say whatever they want. They can write notes, but there are no real activities.
Вот в этих словах выражается то, что они могут говорить все, что угодно, они могут писать какие угодно записки, они могут, но никаких реальных дел после их...
Their task is not to cock-a-doodle-do, as they think, but their task is to teach new generations. And when Churchill let slip that the school teacher has power that prime ministers never dreamed of, this is indeed so, because what they teach students today, in accordance with this, students will tomorrow rule the state and businesses.
If these students are admitted,
they will be. Everyone received the same defective education. Therefore, whoever is allowed there, the result is one and the same. And one theme is closed there. Their own ignorance and misunderstanding is closed. Rarely they blabber, like the late Lifshitz. The economy is like a woman. Could one ever understand it? And what is there to understand? Object of governance. We take the sufficiently general theory of governance, look at the pictures, the scheme of structuring of information when setting the tasks of governance, the vector of objectives, the vector of current state, the vector of the era of governance. We fill it with that which is metrologically consistent. We look further. If you pull which rope, what, where, how will respond? We look. A set of means of governance appears. The next question is, what do we want from this economy? In conditions of methodological governorial illiteracy, these questions cannot even be posed. The Department of Economic Cybernetics, under torture, will not answer what the vector of objectives of governance towards the economy is expressed in, and what the vector of error of governance towards the economy is expressed in. And if you come to any department of technical cybernetics, be it at the Aviation Institute, be it in another place where tasks of governance and technology are really solved, as soon as you are caught on the fact that you are not able to form a vector of objectives of governance, you will be immediately evaluated as a demagogue, an idle talker, and they will be right. Because in engineering, it is so. If we talk about the sufficiently general theory of governance, the prototype, a presentation of an understanding about governance in a book of the publishing house of shipbuilding and governance towards marine mobile objects, which was written in the 70s by guys from the Aurora Research Institute. Yes, there was a terminological apparatus oriented on solving these very tasks, but this was an intelligible terminological apparatus that made it possible to solve tasks. Something was expanded, something was supplemented, the sufficiently general theory of governance was obtained. But it had nothing in common in its genesis with cybernetics. Because if you take the Book of Cybernetics by Norbert Wiener, then you will learn many interesting facts from it. But what governance is, how to organize it will be the subject of your own creativity. Because in that form in which it was, it does not give any idea about the structure of the formulation and solution of governorial tasks. Therefore, when in Stalin's times it was characterized as a bourgeois pseudoscience, all this was correct. It was a PR campaign in the West. A roof was created under which, over the next several decades, all governorial science was collected, and the label cybernetics was hung on it. As a result, over the decades, it has acquired whichever content, but it's split into separate, mutually not understanding each other branches. Medical cybernetics, biological cybernetics, technical cybernetics, economic, and even one of the authors of the current constitution, Comrade Shachrai, worked at the Department of Juridical Cybernetics. The approach itself is correct, since the system of legislation is one of the tools for structureless governance towards society.
I wonder what is taught at the Faculty of Cybernetics. All the brain and mathematicians are there.
It is not a question of what mathematicians are there. But again, academician Krylov said at one time that mathematics is a millstone, and the result is determined not only by mathematical apparatus as such, but by what you put into these millstones. Therefore, abstract mathematics is one thing, and applied mathematics is another.
Plan is the objective. Market is the means of achieving the objective. Who said that the plan is the objective, and the opposition of the plan to the market, ostensibly schizophrenia?
This is a simplified formulation that the plan is the objective, because a plan is a set of objectives and ways and means of achieving them. The wording was given overly simplified in order to explain at the fingertips level that opposing the plan to the market is nonsense. But the opposition of the plan to the market is part of the propaganda campaign of the late 1980s, the times of perestroika, that they say The planned economy is ineffective, the market economy is effective, and it's necessary to move from a planned economy to a market economy. If to speak on the essence of the question, then the market is a process of structureless governance, of self-regulation, of product exchange. The plan, as a plan of biospheric social ecological development, it contains in itself an economic component which should economically ensure the entire politics of the state, the life of the population, and tasks of development. The implementation of the plan in the aspect of the economy presupposes a combination of structural and structureless methods of governance. And, accordingly, the opposition of a planned economy to a market economy, this is the result of complete governorial ignorance, a non-understanding of what and how is happening in the economy. Moreover, I can also refer to authorities. There is such a Japanese man, Akito. He ensured the economic miracle in Japan in the 50s and 60s. He bluntly said that opposing the plan to the market, this is wrong, that the task is to combine both the plan and the market in one system. Galbraith wrote about the same in 1973 in his work Economics and the Public Purpose. He directly wrote that the planning principle should subordinate both the planning system and the market system. But he called the planning system the sector that controls large corporations, such as General Motors, Ford, and so on and so forth. And he called the market system a system of small and medium-sized businesses that really works on the principles of market competition. And he believed, in order to solve the social problems of the United States, to solve ecological problems, it is necessary to deal with the governance towards the economy. Moreover, the governance towards both of these systems, because if this is not done, then large corporations begin to substitute their interests for the interests of the whole people. And the principle, what is good for General Motors is good for America, works. Good, but not in all aspects. Back in the early 1920s, Ford complained about the lack of planning in the US economy. Read his work, My Life and Work. There he writes about this directly. That is, all people who were more or less consistent both in economic practice and in economic theory, who did not break away from practice, they considered it necessary to combine the economic system of the state, both the planning principle and the market method of regulating product exchange. We also adhere to this view, and how to implement it, Economics of Innovative Development. Well, you have to read it for a long time, it is difficult. And in a simpler way, Economy and Noosphere. Thinner than a finger, you can read it in one day lying on the couch. And this phrase is, well, an extremely simplistic approach. That is, to explain the essence that the opposition of the market and the plan is inappropriate. Yes, the plan includes objectives. Self-regulation of product exchange is structureless governance. But here another question arises. Setting the mechanism of self-regulation of market to ensure that the market supplies the products that are needed according to the plan, in the volumes that are needed according to the plan. That is, another profession is needed, a setter of the market mechanism. Market mechanism setter. We do not have such a profession in the report card.
Следующий вопрос.
What is our culture of thinking? What kind of cultures of thinking are there in general?
Культура мышления. Какие вообще бывают культуры мышления? Как бы второй вопрос вытекает из первого.
Cultures of thinking are characterized by a principle that was expressed in the series Shogun back in the 90s. Mr. Taranaga is very smart. He rarely makes mistakes. That is, as academician Amosov wrote, the task of the intellect is to govern something. To govern on the basis of modeling processes at a pace that is ahead of the flow of processes in the real world, in order to choose the best variant. This is the requirement for thinking. Thinking can be intuitive, which gives an immediate result. It will be like this. Why and how it will be, it does not give this. So in the literature, such a case is described. A grandmother healer somewhere in the 19th century was in authority, and she gives a prognosis. There will be famine. The men are clever. Since there will be a famine, what is the point of straining to plow and sow? Spring comes, the whole province does not plow, does not sow. The governor is horrified and shocked. The peasants say, what's the point of sowing? The grandmother said that there would be famine. Autumn comes, all the neighborhoods have amazing harvests, and here there is famine. Grandmother healer thought the given case intuitively. She gave out the result. There will be a famine. But she did not give out the background of the question, why will there be famine? In addition, she was governorially illiterate, because the announcement of a prognosis is a governorial act that can work both for the incarnation of the prognosis into life and for the non-realization of this prognosis, depending on the circumstances. If the grandmother had thought in processes, then, after the intuitive insight was given to her, there would be famine, she would have had to have thought about why there would be famine. Then she would have seen that she announces the prognosis, the peasants listen, do not sow, and by force of the fact that nothing is sown, nothing grows, and there will really be famine. Then the question arises, is it necessary to announce this prognosis or not to announce it? Well, it is clear that in this case it is not necessary to announce the prognosis, it is required to announce another prognosis. Come on guys, this year there will be a big harvest, plow, sow, so that everything is good. This is an example of process thinking. Alternatively, this is also a method of discrete step-by-step thinking. Thinking in states that replace each other, but each of them do not have internal dynamics. Therefore, the cause-effect relationships of states between different states, they are not visible. Unfortunately, the majority of our people think discretely, think in states, think in the mode, this is how it is, I want it to be so. But between what I want and what there is remains beyond the boundaries of thinking. And in order for everything to be good, it is necessary to think in a process way, so that what is can be connected with what is wanted, and moreover, in a life-consistent way, without contradicting the objective laws to which life is subordinated. But the school does not teach this. Moreover, the school suppresses it. Because the entire test system, many non-test exam questions, they are not oriented on forming the skill of process thinking. And process thinking is generally impossible without senses and without a sense of measure. Well, in the end, we get what we get.
That is, in essence, process thinking is a vision of cause-effect relationships.
Yes, this is a vision of cause-effect relationships and the operating of these cause-effect relationships. Then the inner gaze draws a cartoon, figuratively speaking, how from what is to get to what you want, or what will happen if you don't interfere with the process.
And this can be formalized using the method of dynamic programming.
Well, the method of dynamic programming is not something that allows one to formalize it, but it really allows one to schematize a lot. But then again, look, dynamic programming is a sequence of states and transitions between them. That is, the sequence of states and transitions between them, such as it is. This is a certain detailedness of modeling. If we increase the detailedness, then some aspects may open up that are not visible with this detailedness. Nevertheless, the method of dynamic programming, if a certain detailedness is chosen, it allows one to solve many philosophical governorial questions and many applied governorial questions. The section, the sufficiently general theory of governance, this is an orientation precisely on philosophical governorial questions, where it's about the interconnections between the method of dynamic programming and world understanding on the basis of the conception of the triunity of matter-information measure.
What gives an ordinary person an understanding of the triunity?
A counter question: what is an ordinary person? If this is an ordinary crowder of the type grass on the battlefield, then it does not give him anything as long as he agrees with the mission, with the role of grass on the battlefield. If the role of grass on the battlefield does not suit him, then this gives him the opportunity to master his personal potential of development and take place in the quality of human. And his taken placeness precisely in the quality of human is to realize in life the minimum as an upbringer of children and grandchildren, and the maximum as an upbringer of children and grandchildren, and on top of this, well, whatever power, energy, and knowledge will allow.
For example, a person understands that the world consists of matter, information, measure. And how can he apply this understanding in ordinary, everyday life? This is what the question is concluded in.
If there is this understanding, then in a number of cases, all kinds of lies, delusions, and attempts to manipulate, they themselves are exposed.
Attempts at manipulation by someone in relation to himself.
Yes, in relation to himself, in relation to society.
So I can somehow make the connection that with some fundamental science, views should somehow radically change.
Okay, let's take a look at the concretics. There are opinions that we will defeat inflation with market funds, and then the central bank will lower the refinancing rate. Now, if we analyze this from the position of the worldview of the triunity of matter, information, measure, then it will immediately become clear that in the credit financial system of money there is always 100%. That the refinancing rate, like all other interest rates on loans, is a pump, which unidirectionally pumps solvency from society into the banking system. Servicing credit entails an increase in the cost of production and an increase in prices against the background of a decrease in the purchasing power of society. Therefore, it is impossible to defeat inflation using market methods. in principle, since the primary generator of inflation is the interest on the central bank loan.
Well, this is an explanation of the cause-effect relationship. This is a substitution.
Yes, it turns out to be a substitution. But this substitution is not visible on the basis of a worldview, not of the triunity. It is just a different way of thinking, and it is more effective. Because information and algorithmics, they become objective categories of being, and not something ephemeral, to comprehend which is a subjective art. This is of the type time, of the type humanitarian disciplines, because, after all, there is a joke that education is of two types, natural science and its applied branches, and anti-natural, so-called humanitarian. It has in reality the fact that in the humanitarian disciplines, information and algorithmics are not perceived as objective categories of being. If they are not perceived, then there appear such things as the theory of ethnogenesis, this notorious passionarity. Who can measure this passionarity, and how? No how. Does ethnogenesis exist? Yes, it does. Are there regularities? There are regularities, but ethnogenesis and its regularities, they are not at all the same in life as Gumilyov described them in his book. But since for Gumilyov, information and algorithmics, algorithms of development and degradation, are not objective categories of being, but something which is not clear what and how, then the theory of ethnogenesis turns out to be metrologically inconsistent. It can be used in demagoguery, but cannot be used in practice of governance. But if there is a concept and a sense of the triunity of matter-information measure, then the line between the natural and humanitarian sciences disappears. And all humanitarian disciplines have roots in natural science and in fact become really sciences, on the basis of which one can both understand what is happening and how to govern what is happening.
This is including history, philosophy, and sociology,
the whole complex of humanitarian disciplines, including psychology. Because when psychology textbooks begin to write on the theme that there are many theories of personality, then this is akin to there being several variants of the multiplication table. But if psychology had roots in natural science, then it would consider the psyche of man as an informational algorithmic system. The theory of personality would be one, but the theory would give out a determined typology of personality, personality traits. And there, in general, there would not be very much, because we get temperaments. But in the classics, temperaments are considered unchanging. This is a lie. Because there are people who can move from one temperament to another arbitrarily, depending on what circumstances are around and in what temperament it is more convenient for them to interact with these circumstances. That is, the temperament changes. Another thing is that the majority do not know how to change it. Further, the structure of the types of structure of the psyche, also there. Within the boundaries of the types of structure of the psyche, there will also be certain particularities. Well, concerning mainly the interactions of senses, intellect as a whole, process thinking, figurative thinking, discrete logical thinking. Well, this is a component of the culture of thinking of the personality.
There is a section in psychology, it is called transactional analysis, which says that at any moment and period of life, there are, as it were, three beings in a person: a child, an adult, and a parent. And in different periods of life, they should, in theory, change. But one way or another, we can, even in adult life, attribute some jokes to the child, and so on. How can all this be connected into a single certain mega system?
But this is not possible to connect it. It must be presented differently from beginning to end. Well, how do the types of structure of the psyche of people arise? A stop in development, and it turns out that something dominates that should not dominate in adulthood. It is the same with these very roles. Yes, algorithmics is present in children's behavior, and adult behavior, and parental behavior, but for a number of reasons, it can be activated in inappropriate circumstances. Again, these are questions of meaningful will and self-mastery.
That is, if you endow psychology with this very metrological consistency, then it really turns out that inside the psyche, informational streams are flowing.
Yes, in the psyche there is information and algorithmics. Information and many algorithms. What algorithms are absent? What are active? As a result of what are they active? Under the impact of external circumstances, or a person voluntarily, consciously activated them.
And this will not contradict everything that psychological science has achieved.
What has it really achieved? Psychiatry became a branch of medicine before general psychology appeared, and many psychiatrists regard psychologists as their potential patients. This is real. If we talk about what psychology has achieved as a science, well, perhaps there are two commercial enterprises on peripsychological themes. This is the Myers-Briggs personality typology, which is widely used in the West for recruiting, despite the fact that psychologists themselves admit its inconsistency, and Scientologists. There are two commercial enterprises, but there are no bridges from general psychology either to developmental psychology in the interests of pedagogy, or to clinical psychology in the interests of psychiatry. In reality, psychological science as a theory has not achieved anything, at least in the West. Although yes, indeed, there are individual psychologists who sense what is happening in the psyche of other people and are able to have either a beneficial or even more destructive effect on a particular person. But this is their personal art, their personal life skills, but not the result of the fact that there is a psychological science, as a science, after reading the theory of which you can understand something in yourself, you can understand something in others. No, this is absent.
I've seen on myself that psychology is a purely practical science.
Not science, but art.
And if you don't talk too much, then psychology is a purely applied science. I mean art. And if you cannot somehow use this applied art, then really, what then to talk about? Write dissertations, gather some conferences. This is how psychology is. For example, a client psychologist. The practice is that the task of the psychologist is to make money on the client as a sales manager, to make sure that he is constantly resorted to, and he has no nefarious tasks, to simply take up and help a person. Therefore, it is an art. That is, it is the art of making money from your problems. A good, honest psychologist will say, Svetoslav, don't come to me. Please, you'd better go through this problem yourself. Figure it out and that's it. But you don't need to come to me.
Well, somewhere from the internet. A psychopath is someone who builds castles in the air. A lunatic is someone who lives in these castles in the air. And a psychologist is someone who charges rent for living in these castles in the air. This corresponds to reality.
How do you weave hypnosis into this?
This again is art.
Can it be taught to an outsider?
It can be taught if there are prerequisites. Anyone can be taught to play a musical instrument. But the question is, in what quality? Because if there is no ear, then there will be a mechanical pressing on the keys or plucking on the strings, provided that someone tunes the instrument.
The wording, all processes are interconnected and interdependent, and are of an oscillatory character. That is, all processes in the universe are of an oscillatory character.
Yes, it really is so. From the point of view of the theory of oscillations, what does an electron in orbit do? Spins around the nucleus. This is an oscillatory process. What do atoms in a crystal lattice do? They oscillate. How do they oscillate? As many degrees of freedom there are, that much they oscillate.
Well, this is purely physics.
And physics is the basis of everything. If the humanitarian disciplines have no roots in natural science, and natural science is physics, above it there is chemistry, then biology, further, the monkey of the Homo sapiens species appears with the potential for development. When the potential of development is gradually mastered, humanitarian disciplines appear. But fundamentally, it is still the physics of oscillations.
That is, oscillatory processes need to be understood from the point of view of physics in a given formulation.
Yes, and if we talk about informational processes, there is no information without coding systems. A process that carries information, take even a radio receiver, what is this? These are radio waves, and radio waves are oscillations. Why do they carry information? Because there is either amplitude or frequency modulation, but still oscillations.
That is, it is impossible to find a process that does not carry any oscillations.
Really impossible.
Our own biorhythms are an oscillatory process. Does the table have oscillations?
Yes. Resonance. What is this? These are natural frequencies. When the flows coming from some kind of external radiation coincide in frequency with the inherent frequencies, then the object is excited and oscillates.
How to excite the table?
Just like a string on a guitar. Well, put the table on a vibration stand, remove the spectrum of its inherent frequencies from it, and after that, emit radiation at its inherent frequencies. If it is powerful enough, the table will disintegrate in resonance phenomena.
School example. When soldiers walk across a bridge, there is a resonance. Well, with the bridge it is clear, but with three-dimensional objects, it is not very clear to me.
Well, the planes disintegrated from the flutter.
Well, there were some loads.
What loads? Oscillation began, and at certain frequencies the plane disintegrated. Moreover, very quickly disintegrated. The pilot did not even have time to understand what was happening. It all starts with vibration, but the process develops so quickly that within a few seconds the plane could just disintegrate into air.
Therefore, the Americans, when they were making an airplane, which during the war was a fighter, bomber, and attack aircraft, it had a task so that it could die from any height and not fall apart, both on thrust and without thrust. So that it does not fall apart, they tested it with everything. As a result, they had to install a 3-spar wing. That is, whatever they tried with two, nothing worked.
In general, there was a different spectrum of inherent frequencies, and it did not disintegrate with the effect of the flow as it was.
How can the state be run with the help of anecdotes, fables and ditties? How can a beekeeper in a village be a real head within social power?
As for the second, well, a person as a person, he emits something. Biofields are emitted by every living person. But after all, he does not emit like an outlet. We have 50 Hertz, 220 volts and some amperes there. A sine wave will be even if you plug in an oscilloscope and record it. A person emits some code groups in accordance with those systems of coding of information that are characteristic of him as a biological species. And emitting all of this, he interacts with the noosphere of the planet. And further, through the noosphere, he can govern the psychodynamics of society. And then, depending on how he governs, Comrade Trotsky may be late to Moscow from a sanatorium in the Caucasus and not become the General Secretary. Comrade Kaczynski can fly to a maliciously slanderous event in the city of Smolensk.
That is one person. Some say, beekeeper in the village will somehow concentrate, will emit some oscillations, and these oscillations will spread to something, and this something will influence history.
Well, it will influence the events.
How will it influence?
Create the right mood with a human type of structure of the psyche, feel the noosphere of the planet, the segment of Russia in it, and influence. Who's stopping you? Moreover, you see, many things are organized in such a way in nature that there can be no polygons and training grounds. That is, in front of you there is a problem, solve it. It is solved through the noosphere like this, and that's all. No polygons, no training grounds, just take up and solve it. The situation is such that the historically established scientific paradigm does not want to deal with unique phenomena. Unique phenomena are characterized by the fact that they are not repeatable in life and are not reproducible in laboratory conditions. When science in its historically established form, which considers nature to be insane and only man to be intelligent, reaches this problematics, experiments do not confirm. because life is arranged in such a way that for the deaf, they don't serve Mass twice. If it is said that there is such a possibility, you can reject it, you can agree with it, but using this possibility requires a certain mood and certain Ravia's ethical qualities, because if, for example, you did not create a mood, you can create for yourself a stroke, a heart attack, fleeting oncology. If the mood is created, but nraviousness is such that this endeavor is not welcomed from above, then the feedback lines will be closed in such a way that you will know all about it. Again, Comrade Kaczynski. Not a fig should he have flown to Smolensk in order to practice the version of Dr. Goebbels on the theme that the evil tyrant Stalin killed noble Polish officers. This was not in history. Slander is punishable.
I just don't understand that sitting on the couch you can govern some processes.
Yes, you can. Now the question of how the state can be governed with the help of anecdotes, fables, and ditties. Well, let us begin with the fact that fables, ditties, anecdotes are a kind of concentrate. This is a very dense concentrate of information. In fact, it is a marker, a label that reveals a great deal of information. How can you govern? In the old days, when Grigory Vasilievich Romanov was a member of the Politburo and the first secretary of the Leningrad Regional Party Committee, a rumor was spread that his daughter's wedding took place in the Hermitage, and the imperial service was used there. The rumor spread. It never happened in life. When Romanov asked to refute this rumor officially, Andropov allegedly told him that, "Come now, Grigory Vasilievich, why pay attention to all kinds of gossip?" But in the end, the totality of rumors led to the fact that Gorbachev eventually became the successor, and not Romanov. Because had Romanov been elected, then Romanov would have been a different education, a different personal culture of psychic activity, a different attitude towards people. Moreover, next to Romanov, there was nothing similar to Raisa Maximovna. This is one of the examples of career-ruining gossip. Is this governance? It's governance. This, moreover, is very severe governance, governance towards cadre politics. In the times of the empire, there were guys who came up with gossip and anecdotes about Rasputin. There are also guys in the CIA who have been making up anecdotes for many decades, first about the Soviet reality, then about the Russian one. It really works. Fake news is one of the sides of this matter, because on the one hand, fake news is a certain nonsense and bull. But in this nonsense and bull, there is a component purpose-orientedly constructed for the solution of certain tasks. Therefore, if the gossip and rumors are launched correctly, then a lot of things can be done. Another question is how you will have to answer for this later, because any lie, sooner or later, becomes the basis for the working out of inherently incorrect decisions. Or, if a person has lost trust, then in some situations, he will be left alone with force majeure circumstances, And those who could help him to sort out these circumstances, they will take the position of, let's see, or take a position openly hostile. Therefore, everything here is definitely simple. Well, as for the second part, how to govern from the village, few people can, but nevertheless they are able to govern through the noosphere from anywhere, not only from the village.
I just have a desire to take this into science.
The question of entering science is simple. Vernadsky, crazy or not crazy? If Vernadsky is not crazy, then let's discuss the theory of noosphere and interaction of any person with the noosphere, not like little children, but seriously. But for this, psychology must have roots in natural science. And the carrier of the psyche and all psychic processes is not the biochemistry of the organism. The biochemistry of the organism has a very small performance speed. The information capacity is too small in order to carry the whole thing. But the biofield system, there are precisely suitable frequency ranges, and the information capacity is quite sufficient to carry the psyche as a process. But no one is engaged in this, because European medicine is characterized by complete disregard for the biofield anatomy and biofield physiology of the organism. It is not to say that they cannot say that there is a violation. They do not know the norms. Now, if, for example, there is no leg or no arm, the doctor looks and says, yes, a cripple. Nobody argues. Yes, indeed, someone was unlucky there due to some circumstances, but there is also an organism. The organism is meat, flesh, physiological fluids, and fields. And there are interactions of biofields with meat, flesh, and physiological fluids. Accordingly, there cannot but be biofield anatomy of the organism, and accordingly, if there are any violations in the biofield anatomy, then this should somehow affect the work of everything else, including meat, bones, physiological fluids. And further, there should be some kind of biofield physiology as one of the components of the general physiology of the organism. The European medical tradition does not want to know this. And if someone says that ill health is caused by disturbances in the biofield, then this is a charlatan, a witch doctor, an ignoramus, and so on and so forth. But you see, if you are not schizophrenics, and you do not think that physics is a pseudoscience, then any atom emits some kind of fields. Any molecule emits fields. If the tissue of a living organism is assembled from molecules, it also emits fields. In addition, there can be structures that are emitters in general as structures. Do quasars emit in space? They emit. If you say that it is not cells, not the organism as a whole, not its organs that emit biofields, then you are a schizophrenic, because then your views are incompatible with physics. If you say that the human organism is an exception, then you are a schizophrenic again, twice. And the circumstance that medicine does not know and does not want to know is another question. But as mentioned, jurists know that ignorance of laws does not absolve from responsibility. And if with juridical laws, ignorance of laws is also allowed in some situations, or abuse of legislative and other types of power also allows one to do a lot, then you will not deceive the laws of nature, and ignorance of the laws of nature does not exempt from damage connected with their violation, because this is also a law of nature.
Pages 278, 279 of the first volume of Sociology. Quote, "The Almighty speaks in the language of life's circumstances. One must learn to understand this language in order to understand the meaning of life in the stream of events and act in accordance with it. What do life circumstances say to millions and billions of people around the world, living on the brink or below the poverty line?"
This speaks to the fact that one cannot be a humanoid ape. That to a person, creative potential is given, will is given, the possibility to acquire it, service is given. And accordingly, if the quality of life does not suit you, then you have to think. The process of thinking is a slow but reliable process. And if it's grass on the battlefield, then, excuse me, what claims to the quality of life of a person and human rights can there be?
But they are also hostages of these very life circumstances. And in general, there are no variants to change anything, because the environment is like that.
The question is something else. If you want to consume a lot, then yes, they are in a terrible situation. But if you want to become a human, then in general, the organism does not need much. Especially in the conditions of Africa and a warm climate. Another question is whether he wants to become a human or he wants to consume. Simply, if you think about the meaning of life, what does he want? Well, in the majority of cases, people, after all, want to consume, not to give something. Well, if a individual wants to consume, then from above, the support is at zero, or at a minimum. If a person wants to give something, and what he wants to give is glorious, then under the most minimal conditions, he will give. What he himself cannot give, the Almighty will support. Give through him somehow. Give definitely. But further the question arises, the criterion, cost-resultness. The result that is provided by a palace, a staff of palace servants, and so on and so forth, and the very same result, which is provided by a hut in the forest and the gifts of nature, the result can be one and the same. But its cost, and accordingly the effectiveness of the activity, it is different. Because the question is really about what people want. The bulk of the population wants to consume. The bulk of the population wants to live according to the laws of the ape pack. And if they are not satisfied with something, then it's not with the herd pack character of the organization of their life, but with the low hierarchical status in this pack. That's it.
but they simply cannot escape from the conditions in which they live.
They will escape. If there is a desire, they will escape. Therefore, some live in the mode of a visual aid for others on the theme, you cannot live like this.